It's nice to be back in my usual comfort. Statement begins. I have officially begun Season 2 of the Magnus Archives. I will be covering episode 41, Too Deep, to episode 62, First Edition. Clearly, this video is a lot longer than the other ones. I didn't think I had very much to say, but then after finishing the spreadsheet, there was a lot more than I thought. This is Edwin. Any pronouns. Welcome to First Time Listener. While I'm aware that I myself am developing a bit of paranoia in this project, I must admit to find myself growing an intense excitement at every new episode. Yes, this is dangerous. Yes, I'm potentially compromised. But my memory is growing nearly encyclopedic because of the spreadsheet and the relisting, and I'm catching things so much faster and so much clearer. I'm finally getting some shreds of answers here. None of the bigger questions. I'm still missing underlying causes and deeper plans. But I don't feel clueless. Dare I say I'm getting a little bit cocky at what I am picking up. My favourite episode of this bunch is episode 55, Pest Control, and after that, genuinely, so many of them were of such high caliber that I couldn't decide. If I listed my favourites, it would be half of the damn season. As a change of pace, I thought I'd start this episode with some questions from my watching viewers. Multiple of you have expressed wanting to hear a few more opinions, a bit more about me. It's the start of a new season, so I figured, why not? First up, who are some of your favourite statement makers? My favourite right now is still Antonio Blake, or, as I suspect, Oliver. Not only were his precognitive abilities fascinating and relatable, he was just one of those people who simply sounded kind. I'm also quite the fan of Alice Daisy Tonner, of whom you will be hearing more about. And I liked Jordan Kennedy, the Exterminator, too. Personally, I am the most impressed by statement makers who have extremely human solutions to extremely supernatural problems. Jonathan Gillespie and his block of ice immediately comes to mind as to combat his sleepwalking with the coffin key. And Jennifer Ling in Grifter's Bones, who left her phone recording in the bar and ran outside the door. Next question. Who's your favourite in the archive crew? Well, I, of course, have a particular kinship with Mr. Jonathan Sims. There is something extremely charming about the antics of Tim and Martin. No, I can't decide which one is my favourite. They both are. I like them a lot. I've been asked this next one in multiple ways, but the general gist is, what makes a monster a monster? I don't know. I don't think becoming beyond human automatically makes you monstrous. At least it would not bode well for me if it did. Honestly, I think monstrousness falls closer with violence and malice. More so any creature, demon, or thing that was once human. I'd sooner call Jürgen Leitner a monster than I would Jane Prentiss. But you all know I have a very soft spot for Jane. What's your deepest fear? Well, I'd rather not dwell too seriously into the deepest ones, but trypophobia is rather standard. I also admit to having a strange type of claustrophobia. Enclosed or small spaces have never bothered me, but tight crowds or new buildings that I don't know the layout of. I think it's something about being in places you can't easily escape from, or you can't control how you leave. I'm really not big on mazes. And I'm also a little bit afraid of dogs. Do you feel like you're a different person than you were at the start of this process? Yes. I didn't fully anticipate how much this project would affect me. And my environment, it's a bit atypical of my usual adventures. And lastly, are you doing okay? Is Jon? That's the end of that, I think. So, season 2. It began with much more agitation in the air. Jonathan Sims suspects one of his co-workers killed Gertrude Robinson and is now extremely suspicious of the lot, especially with a certain paranoia over what will happen to himself. He feels like he's being watched and is being extremely reckless in response. Furthermore, he created these supplements at the end of his tapes, featuring his secret investigations towards the murder of Gertrude Robinson. As for Mr. Sims's first supplement, it got to me more than I thought it would. It was the first time.
If you're hearing this, I assume you're my replacement following my death or disappearance, and have received instructions on where to find them.
It was the first time it felt like Mr. Sims was speaking directly to me. Afterwards, I felt sick to my stomach for the next hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that, even without my camera, I felt like I was being watched. I've been more active in the comments of these video logs, and you all keep calling me the archivist. Not a collector, not a researcher, not an archivist, the archivist. That title belongs to Jonathan Sims, not me. I am not his successor, because that means that something happened, and that something happened to him, and nothing. No, it means nothing. I can't control what you all call me. I can't seem to control much of anything anymore. Moving on. Corrections and additions. During this segment, I'll also be rearranging my conspiracy board. Most importantly, I am an idiot. I am so thick and so clueless, it's a miracle that I can connect anything at all in these logs. The impersonation of Sasha James stole the tape of episode 24, Strange Music, because it was the very first time we heard the real Sasha James's voice. And this erasing of the original Sasha, combined with the impersonation's fascination and connection to the hypnotic table, directly connects the impersonation of Sasha James with the impersonation of Graham Folger in episode 3, Across the Street. I will be speaking more on this. Next, I am scratching the theory that John from Do Not Open, or as I will now call him, Coffin John, and Raymond Fielding are the same person. With more details of the past brought to light, it doesn't make much sense anymore. I was also going to raise the possibility of John Amherst being Coffin John, but the only similarity between these two is their first name. Michael is a being unto himself. He is not any of the other Michaels. I will be closing this line of thinking. Lastly, I think I want to take a step back from categorizing things so intensely. I will impose the same rigor, but fitting undefinable things into boxes doesn't seem to be a good system right now. Especially with the new information regarding Lightness books, I think it opens for a lot of unexplained phenomena to not fit so neatly into categories. I want to focus more on the connections rather than the definitions, if that makes sense. Also, as an update with the transcripts, Season 2 on the website is completely out of order, with 1 or 2 episodes entirely missing. And yes, I did resort to a different source for reliable transcripts, but that site didn't allow me to download them without requesting Google Drive access. I am beginning to understand John's initial frustrations with that of Gertrude Robinson. Now on to motifs. Yes, I'm removing some, but they'll likely be added back in the future or were too vague to be a qualifying category. But for now, I'm also adding spiders and webs, as well as characters with the intense feeling of being watched. I've also caught on to the continuing trend of the dark, but that's a later point, not a motif. Now, we have some new people to discuss. Most importantly, I have met Gertrude Robinson. Well, I've heard her from the tapes that Police Constable Basira Hussein has given John, and Gertrude is nothing like I imagined her. I didn't share John's initial opinion of her. I didn't think she was reckless or bad at her job. I have always thought that she was intentionally obfuscating the archive from the start. I still think that. It took me a while to lend my opinion here, but I do think she's trying to make it easier for Jon to connect the dots. But I'm growing skeptical that pushing him towards information is an inherently benevolent cause. And the way she speaks about statement makers. I never realized how attached Jon can be until I heard Gertrude. Particularly in her final comments in episode 44.
As it stands, I think it's somewhat amazing that the whole town appears to have made it through in one piece. Obviously, it's a good thing the children survived, but it does pique my interest in Ivan Utkin.
Oh, weird. She spoke like the lives of the children were an afterthought. Like the deaths of people didn't particularly occur to her until then. I don't like it. After her conversation with Mary Key, I've landed on the opinion that Gertrude presents herself as the type of person who would work alongside the lesser of two evils. Gertrude would ally with people of whom Jon or I would never even consider. And I know that she has figured out things that Jon and I haven't wrapped our heads around yet. Most importantly, I'm having a very hard time believing she's entirely on our side. And I don't even know the shape of the other sides yet. We've also met Police Constable Basira Hussain in episode 42, section 31. Basira shines a much clearer light on how the paranormal looks from a witness, as well as giving more clarity towards how often paranormal activity is reported, and what the general response is. She's very grounded, while her occupation initially left me a bit hesitant. I like Basira. And it was extremely funny and so very like Tim when he implied that Basira and Jon were together. It was actually at that moment where I realized that this whole time I had already assumed that Jon was gay. And I can't even work out why. Now, let's talk about Detective Alice Daisy Tonner. I really like Daisy. I like how she scares Jon and they push at each other's egos. In a world full of secrets and mysteries, Daisy being so blunt is refreshing. I like that she's so standoffish and that she pushes at people instead of sneaking around them. Jon needs someone to make him second guess himself and his recklessness. I am very excited to learn more about her. Next, I would also like to discuss the Institute itself and all the things that Jon has learned about the workers during his secret investigations. One thing that I'm finding it very hard to wrap my head around is how the Institute itself works. Not in the paranormal function sense, I will get to that, but in the literal corporate organization of it. I know there's an artifact storage, there's a library, and there are filing clerks and researchers both inside and outside the archive. But when Jon is in charge of the archive department, why does he also sometimes collect statements from new people? We also still don't know who Rosie is, but I'm going to assume she's either assistant head of the Institute or head of artifact storage. As for the workers, Timothy Stoker received a first in anthropology at Trinity College in Cambridge, and then climbed the publishing house corporate ladder for 5 years, until Tim applied to work at the Institute. While Jon took this shift as suspicious, I'm not nearly as skeptical. It's clear to me that Tim had his own paranormal experience that shifted his career path. I wonder if he has a statement in the archive. But I'm also very biased, because I really like Tim. Martin Blackwood is 29 years old and lied on his curriculum vitae to get the job at the archive. He doesn't have a master's in parapsychology and due to his mother's health had to drop out of school. Thankfully, Jon promised not to tell Elias. It's nice to see how kind Martin is. It's in a lot of small moments, like how he hovers over Jon in the canteen after Jon got stitches after the incident with the bread knife. It's nice to have someone in the Institute with a very outwardly kind soul. Honestly, I've never suspected Martin or Tim. They don't have any associated ulterior motives, and I also think it'd be a bummer to not have them around. On to Elias Bouchard. Yes, the CCTV footage of the week of Gertrude's death cleared his name technically, but he is still hiding a lot. He started working at the Magnus Institute in 1991 in artifact storage. He was also a filing clerk. In a quick 5 years, he had become head in 1996 after his predecessor James Wright passed away. The only recent worker who has worked here prior to Elias is Gertrude. When Elias was younger, he graduated as a third in Christ Church College in Oxford. He was apparently considered to be a pothead. While I'm all for character change, a large sudden change in personality rings quite a red flag amidst the rest of his suspicion. And Jonathan Sims. Jonathan, at the moment, is reckless, quick to action, and very, very stubborn. His current level of paranoia causes him to be very sloppy. He gets caught spying on his co-workers. He has the goal to break into Gertrude Robinson's apartment. If he doesn't find his level head, he's going to do something he is going to regret. I understand the severity of his situation, but he just worries me. I don't want anyone to kill him, and I don't want to hear it on tape. Although, maybe I shouldn't speak so quickly on the matter, because I agree with him on that front. I'd rather hear his death than have it be another mystery. Jonathan Sims started working at the Institute as a researcher in 2012. It isn't clear if this was a practical researcher or one of the archives. The end of season 1 referenced that Jon believed in the supernatural prior to working at the archives, but he didn't clarify what made him this way. I wonder if he made a statement when he was younger. The real Sasha James began working at the Institute as a practical researcher in artifact storage, of which she disliked so much she requested to be transferred after a few months. The current impersonation of Sasha is consistently entranced by the hypnotic table in artifact storage, of which I'll be calling the Hypno Table. She has been spending her lunch breaks at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum and claims her new boyfriend Tom works there. Jon describes Tom's smile like it's the same smile every time. Like it's a stock photo. Hopefully Jon catches on. His first suspicions arose when Michael told Jon that the impersonation of Sasha is lying to him. Yes, before the bigger things, we should talk about meeting Michael. Episode 47, A New Door. Real estate agent Helen Richardson was sent through a mysterious door into spiraling hallways when Michael came to visit a house on St. Albans Avenue in Wimbledon. After she gave a statement to Jon, she walked through a door in the room that Michael later pointed out to Jon was never there in the first place. Michael took her. Jon asked Michael if he owned the hallways, to which Michael claimed that no. To which was stated, stop. Michael. No! I don't want him in my psyche. I draw the line there. Prentiss was bad enough. I don't want to get stuck. I don't need him in my mind. I refuse. Michael asked Jon if his hand technically owned his stomach. My response would have been, no, it doesn't, but they have the same goal, to keep me alive. So what are you keeping alive, Michael? He knew about Sasha. Let's talk about Sasha. Sasha said to Jon that it was the hypno table that took Graham, not the spindly creature. The table is a web, not a fractal. And it was previously in custody of Brecon and Hope. The hypno table was brought to Jon, specifically to the archivist, on September 7, 2016 by Brecon and Hope Deliveries, along with a Zippo lighter with spider web patterns. This lighter is not to be confused with the one of Gerard Keyes, whose Zippo was patterned with eyes. Brecon and Hope were also seen collecting the calliope from the Denikin house in episode 24, Strange Music, the coffin in episodes 2 and 61, Do Not Open and Hard Shoulder, and were also seen in Daniel Rawlings' shop unloading things into the basement of episode 54, Still Life. They also delivered the pale yellow stole to the oratory in Father Burroughs' statement, which vanished quickly after. We encountered them the most distinctly in episode 61, Hard Shoulder. Daisy pulled over the Brecon and Hope Deliveries van on July 24, 2002. In the van there were 3 people, Brecon and Hope, then a man named Tom. What? You thought I wouldn't catch that? Yes, I definitely think this Tom is the impersonation of Sasha's boyfriend. So, what does this connect? Well, we've got Graham and Sasha and the hypno table, then the hypno table to Brecon and Hope, and Sasha to Tom, and then Tom back to Brecon and Hope. For now, I want to go into the history of the hypno table. Working backwards, it came into the archive's possession on September 7, 2016. Prior to that, it was last seen April 27, 2007, in an apartment in Clapham belonging to Graham Folger. Graham stated that he found it in a second-hand shop and spent a very long time restoring it. There was a square hole in the middle of the table. This is because it was supposed to hold a box that was destroyed by Ivo Lensick on November 23, 2006. Lensick uprooted a dead tree in the backyard of 105 Hilltop Road in Oxford. The tree poured blood, and under the tree was an ornate box. Inside of it was an apple that decayed in front of Lensick's eyes, and out crawled tons of little spiders. Lensick destroyed the tree and the box. On the very same day, and Agnes Montague hanged herself in her Sheffield flat.
But tied by a chain to her waist was a severed human hand, a right hand. Its owner was never identified, but the coroner was apparently quite perplexed, as tissue decay would seem to indicate that the hand's original owner must have died at almost the exact same time as Agnes.
Agnes Montague was 26 years old, which, given that she was also mentioned to have been 10 to 11 years old in the 1960s, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, let's retrace our steps. This is the current timeline of 105 Hilltop Road, Oxford. Walter Fielding bought 105 Hilltop Road in 1891. It was passed down to Alfred Fielding in 1927 and came into the possession of Raymond Fielding in 1957. Throughout the 60s, it became a halfway house. Ronald Sinclair in episode 59, Recluse, tells his own experiences. Sinclair was one of the kids in the halfway house in the early to mid-1960s. He described Fielding as young, with long brown hair, being friendly and approachable, smiled a lot, easygoing. While Sinclair lived there, he described it as hazy, as if working on muscle memory. Everything was a blur. The only things Raymond Fielding insisted on was church on Sunday, then a Sunday evening meal. He'd removed the tablecloth in the dining room, revealing the hypno table, Sinclair states.
I don't remember how long we sat around the table those evenings, nor do I have any memory of what we might have eaten.
I worry about what the children were fed. Based on Father Burroughs' experiences, I've got a very bad feeling that it might have involved cannibalism. Agnes appeared 2 months before Sinclair's 18th birthday in the middle of the winter. 10 or 11 years old, it was assumed she was Raymond's daughter. She never came to church or to the hypno table dinner, and Raymond Fielding feared her. Why? What was she? Then, on Sinclair's 18th birthday, the young Agnes kissed him on the cheek before he left the halfway house. Unfortunately, he hypnotically returned to the house against his will. He went to the basement and found previous residents of the house covered in webs and bloated with egg sacs in their bodies, all sitting around the hypno table. There was the small wooden box. Inside was a green apple. When Sinclair bit it, a hot pain erupted in his mouth, but Sinclair raised his hand of his own accord, snapped out of the trance, and ran. Fielding was now confused and angry, standing up with
small, twitching shapes tumbling out of his jacket.
Something snapped him out of that trance. Was it Agnes? Is she a ghost somehow? The years after Agnes arrived at the halfway house, children were seen increasingly less and less. Then Raymond Fielding disappeared when Agnes was 18 to 19, putting the year around 1972. People's pets in the area began going missing. Then in 1974, a child named Henry White disappeared. A week afterwards, 105 Hilltop Road caught fire. Agnes was nowhere to be seen, nor was Henry White. The only remains found in the house was that of Raymond Fielding, a charred skeleton, missing a right hand. I'm thinking maybe there's some sort of sacrifice going on, in which Raymond Fielding sacrifices children to keep his own child alive? But Agnes figured it out as she grew older, opposed him, and used Raymond Fielding to stay alive instead? I don't know. The next time we hear about 105 Hilltop Road is 32 years later in mid-November 2006. Eva Lensick is called to work on the wiring in the house. While working there, an unaged Raymond Fielding came to the door. He was said to look out of a Polaroid. Fielding immediately looked out to the tree in the garden. Lensick left him alone, and then only returned to see a pile of scorched wood and ash where Fielding was just standing. Lensick returned later that month and destroyed the tree in the box. Father Edwin Burroughs arrived on the same day on November 23rd, 2006. Father Burroughs was asked to perform an exorcism on the house. It went horribly, horribly wrong.
I began to pray again for protection, not for the place this time, but for me. As I did, I felt something answer me. And yet, I cannot stress this enough. What answered was not God. It wasn't him. Something else answered my call for protection. I felt my lips move. They made no sound that I could hear, but I felt them form every syllable. I am not for you. I am marked.
It only stopped when Ivo Lensick uprooted the tree. I originally suspected Father Burroughs to be connected to the People's Church of the Divine Host. However, after this analysis, I'm not so sure. The People's Church is associated with darkness and prayers and chanting, the jaundiced churchgoers and spiders. It feels more aligned with another side of the fray. I'm to wonder if there was a presence that possessed the tree and later moved to Father Burroughs as a means to protect itself from destruction. But that doesn't justify Bethany Connor and the warning of it wanting his faith, nor the connections to 89 Belinden Road. What is this presence? I'm not sure. It doesn't exactly sound like a spider, to say the least. Yes, I've caught on to them now. Sorry, Martin. Let's discuss the evil spiders. Hilltop Road, Oxford, appears to be a primary location of this thing with spiders. However, since the season 1 finale, spiders have begun to permeate the tunnels underneath the archives, eating the worm husks left by Jane Prentiss. Trevor Herbert, the vampire killer, also killed one of these spider people. Not only was he incorrectly reported dead in episode 10, but his second statement in episode 56, Children of the Night, showed him confronting a woman in her 40s with matted hair and a bulky appearance. In January 2010, he followed her, sliced her accidentally, and thousands of small, tiny spiders poured out. She also had a very strange power. When she made eye contact with him, he suddenly felt an extremely intense urge to leave and do what he desired most. Interesting. It appears that some spider people have more control of their form than others. This subject was described as bulky and jarring, but Raymond Fielding didn't have a single mention of strange movements or bulky clothing. I wonder. Elias's school? Christ Church College? It's in Oxford. I originally wondered if Elias could be a replicant horror, but his voice doesn't distort the cassette tapes like the impersonation of Sasha James. And Elias is very good at changing subjects. Possibly with a subtle hypnotic flair behind him, making things blurry, a haze. He went to school in Oxford, and the phrase pothead is often associated with terms of a slacker and delinquent. While I also obviously think people can change, it feels dangerously close to the description of the children at Hilltop Road. And I originally thought the description of spider people were often very inhuman or obvious, but Raymond Fielding was never described as looking as such. Could Elias be one of the spider people? I do think he's the one going through the tunnels, that or the impersonation of Sasha, or both. And there are spiders in the tunnels. It sounds really jarring and ridiculous right now, but there's something to it that feels strangely sensical. The other spider was Carlos Vittori in episode 16, Arachnophobia, with a strange spider stalking him and his dead body being covered in webs. This leads me to my next point. We are back to Jane Prentiss. Despite my obvious fears towards her, I really wish she had another statement, or that we had some other account of the earlier days of her infestation. Why was Prentiss in Carlos Vittori's place when Martin found her in episode 22, Colony? Not only that, but I look at the maps, okay? Jane Prentiss's apartment, Harriet Lee's apartment, and Carlos Vittori's apartment are all within a 10-minute walk of each other. Actually, Harriet Lee and Carlos Vittori lived on adjacent streets, all in Archway on the Northern Line. But I don't understand what made them targets. They all had different landlords and all seemingly did not know each other prior. But if Prentiss is connected to the spiders, then let's also discuss Prentiss's other connections. Jane Prentiss was originally fired from her job over a breakdown about an ant infestation at Good Energy Spiritual Shop in Archway. Jordan Kennedy was the exterminator who took care of Prentiss and her wasp's nest, and he also handled a different ant infestation down south in Bromley. He talks about it in episode 55, Pest Control.
And I couldn't escape the idea that the building was somehow sick.
It was covered in more ants than he ever saw, with oily rot everywhere. Kennedy described a jaundiced yellow fridge.
And I couldn't quite shake the feeling that it was pulsing ever so gently.
I wish he opened the damned thing. This led to his interaction with Jon Elias.
He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, but it was hard to be sure of his shape inside the huge brown suit he was wearing.
Upon seeing his extermination supplies, Amherst attacked Kennedy, and Kennedy lit him on fire. Amherst immediately caught, and there was a sick smell with it. The only other time Kennedy smelled this rancid scent was when Arthur Nolan, Prentiss's landlord, lit himself on fire after seeing the wasp's nest, and when Prentiss herself was burned. I'm pretty sure now that Jane Prentiss is likely dead. Even though there's still something in the back of my head, still thinking she's out there somewhere. Amherst was also in charge of the jaundiced, sick-lead Ivy Meadows care home in August 2011 during episode 36, Taken Ill. His patients were covered in jaundiced skin, disgusting rashes, and sickness. And, oddly enough, Trevor Herbert burned the place to the ground. So, what does this mean? I think there's an implication to be made that Jon Amherst is a spider person or insect variant based on his large coat, not to mention Trevor Herbert being on his trail. There's also something to jaundiced skin and sickness, particularly with Father Edwin Burroughs when he was at that church. Did all of them have faith over something? And why do some of them get affected differently? What about Prentiss? Was she chosen due to her witchy tendencies or her proximity to the wasp's nest or the other ant infestation? Did she know something? Or was she part of something that she never let on? Arthur Nolan is certainly interesting. He said something along the lines of hoping it wouldn't get this far before lighting himself on fire to destroy the wasp's nest. His chest was scarred by a stylized flame. It's not the lightless flame, is it? Because this is reminding me a lot of Diego Molina and Gerard Key. Diego was an assistant curator with a loan in the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, London. In episode 43, Police Constable Basir Hussain witnessed Molina coming out of a burning building in Clapham without a scratch in August 2011. While I originally thought this might be Graham's apartment complex, it is notably a residential home that was burned. Molina stated things about a cleansing fire and that all shall be ash, and said the name Asag, a Sumerian demon. Molina later that day committed suicide in a bathtub with boiling water. He had a small red book that was taken by the police. Gerard Key was looking for it in a previous episode. I wonder if Basira still has it. Molina's venture continues in episode 12, First Aid. Both Gerard Key and Diego Molina were admitted to a hospital for burns. Molina began chanting similar things, and Gerard Key stabbed him with a scalpel. Molina caught fire and burned to ash. However, this was in December of 2011, leaving a strangely large gap between his suicide attempt in August and hospital admittance in December. No, my ancient history knowledge is not very expansive. However, the civilization of Sumer is considered to be the oldest human civilization. My implication here being, whatever they were fighting, or maybe, whatever we're fighting, it may be older or as old as human civilization. There are giant creatures in these stories, I am not talking about Jared Hopworth or Jane Prentiss or anything that used to be human. There's something else, lingering in the shadows. I used to group them all in as the replicant horrors, but if the impersonation of Sasha is right about the table being the source of the replication, then maybe these creatures are something else. Something beyond spiders and insects. I should broaden the scope. One of them was found in Michael's hallways, another in the hole within the Maria Fairchild shipwreck, then another spindly creature's fingers in the wall of the workhouse designed by George Gilbert Scott. The description is similar to that of Montauk's monster, Graham's creature, and the creature referenced inside of the homophobic the Ming Dynasty pot. That pot is extremely interesting because it was covered in fractals. You see, I started to look into the history and mathematical application to fractals, and boy, did I find something. So, Robert Smirk. His whole architectural theory. Balance. Not symmetry. Balance. That's a fractal. Fractals, in extremely broad terms, are geometric shapes that can be replicated into patterns in infinitely smaller scales of self-similarity. These shapes have space-filling capacity within a complex pattern. Oh, so why didn't Robert Smirk mention them? Because the word fractal wasn't invented until 1975 by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot. He wasn't even alive when the word existed. So where do fractals pop up in nature? Literally everywhere. Clouds, craters, crystals, earthquakes, lightning, ocean waves, snowflakes. But the scarier implications: blood vessels, DNA, neurons, proteins, and heartbeats. Ivo Lensig's father had an obsession with fractals, stating they were the verge of a great truth. But then he was stopped.
He claimed that someone was following him, told me that they were planning to stop his work. I asked him who it was, but he shook his head violently and said I'd know him when I saw him, because all the bones are in his hands.
That sounds an awful lot like Michael, doesn't it? So what does Smirk want to do with fractals? Well, I think that whatever creature was reaching out of George Gilbert Scott's wall plays a part in it. If fractals are the building blocks of our world, our bodies, I'm inclined to think that creating the perfect design, the perfect building, could crack something and let creatures through. Or maybe they can alter our own designs. Like Leitner's books. Leitner's books are the primary reason as to why I'm loosening the scope of my definitions. If you can have a book come true, categories make increasingly less sense. Michael Crewe, as I suspected, popped up again in episode 46, Literary Heights. His journey in the episode replicated that of the Exalteur's tale itself, ending in the same way the book did, with him jumping off of a clock tower to be free of the electrical creature following him. Michael Crewe had also read the Bone Turner's tale. So what makes certain Leitner books attached to you? Can anyone draw power from them? Or does the book choose you? Mark you? Jared Hopworth also appeared in episode 49, The Butcher's Window. He has now become the Bone Turner, quite literally gaining the ability to remove the bones from a person's body like taking a hand out of a glove. He has grown monstrous in his physique and appears to be feeding some of the bones into a fleshy pit in the ground of the butcher's shop. While I originally compared this to the doorway in the tunnels of the Magnus Institute and to the cavern in the Maria Fairchild shipwreck, I'm not sure yet. But on the topic of the Maria Fairchild, I think it only fair that we mention a new suspicious subject. Simon Fairchild. Simon Fairchild was involved in episode 21, Freefall, episode 51, High Pressure, and episode 57, Personal Space. The Fairchilds are a wealthy family in Cornwall, investing in aerospace technologies, shipping logistics, and underwater drilling and construction. Both of the statement makers of Freefall and High Pressure had paranormal experiences immediately after interacting with him. Furthermore, Jon remembered his name from one of his very first cases.
One of my first cases as a researcher for the Institute in 2012 was looking into the history of the jewellers in Hackney that had reported cases becoming cracked in the night. Nothing was ever taken, but each morning it would be like a heavy weight had been dropped upon them. Looking into it, it turned out that the jewellers had, in the 1930s, belonged to a con artist and fence who had attracted the displeasure of the local population. When one particularly irate customer threw him out of a fourth-floor window into a crowded street at midday, no one claimed to have seen anything. While I was never able to discover the original name of the con artist, one of his many, many aliases was Simon Fairchild.
Fairchild was also involved in the Daedalus space station in September 2007, in which statement maker Carter Chilcott experienced intense hallucinations brought about by space isolation. He also fell into a half-lucid state where he kept envisioning ancient graveyards and empty seas. This experiment was led by Conrad Lucas, with 3 notable sponsors: Nathaniel Lucas, the Fairchild family's Pinnacle Aerospace, and Optic Solutions Limited, a camera manufacturer based in Ny-Ålesund, Norway. I believe this is the first official connection of the Lucas family to Ny-Ålesund, and therefore to the People's Church of the Divine Host. On the topic of Ny-Ålesund, the stories of Robert Montauk and Natalie Ennis both involved tampering with the lights to keep the darkness. Robert Montauk's death involved an actual creature, particularly with Maxwell Rayner saying to him,
You didn't think you could kill it for long, did you?
With the giant creature in the darkness of the Maria Fairchild, I am inclined to believe that the People's Church of the Divine Host is on the side of summoning something. Still not sure what it is exactly, but it isn't good. And with the connection of these spindly creatures towards fractals, that would also connect them to Robert the Smirk, who is already connected to the Institute via his tunnels. This now solidifies 2 separate connections of large creatures and deadly cults directly to the Magnus Institute. I worry. And I worry because Mary Key's mother Elsa worked at the Institute as well, with its
slavish devotion to you and your patron.
The least complicated part of this story involved Key's Leitner book. It also confirms the strange books were powerful before he got a hold of them in his library. Leitner somehow marks them, but I don't know if that changes anything. Hers is what I'll call the Book of the Dead. In 1955, Mary Key was 9 years old and secretly observed Dr. Margaret Tellison. Tellison would kill her patients, flay them, and use their skin as pages in the book. Written in Sanskrit, each page holds the ghost of the victim. What disgusted Key the most wasn't the cold-blooded murder, it was the fact that Dr. Tellison used this power for profit. In Key's disgust, she slit Dr. Tellison's throat and very roughly put her in the book. She murdered someone at 9 years old. It's also clear that, based on the description of Mary Key in episode 4 Page Turner, Gerard Key later added her to the book as well. Mary Key seemed to have expected this.
After a lifetime, I know all its secrets save one. And I have a pretty good idea about how to find that.
But that's not nearly the most important part of the story.
I don't know what this place is. You do, though, don't you? We're on the same side, really, even if Elias disagrees.
By 2008, Gertrude Robinson had figured out the function of the Magnus Institute. 7 years before her murder. So what else did she achieve in that time? And who did she conspire with? The farthest I've gotten to cracking the meaning is tracking down the statements involving other libraries. And the feeling of being watched. In episode 23, Schwarzwald, Albrecht von Closen entered the mausoleum of Johann von Württemberg, finding shelves of books that had been destroyed as well as a mysterious ghostly figure.
His head was completely bald, and his eyes were missing. They were just empty sockets, but they stared at me. They saw me. Believe or dismiss anything else in my letter as you wish, Jonah, but I swear to you that I stood face to face with a man with no eyes, and he saw me.
Then the Serapeum of Alexandria in episode 53, Crusader.
I tried to tell myself that it was just the way the skull had walked over the years that made him look like he was screaming. His eyes were gone, but rather than simply decaying into nothingness, there were ragged scratches around the edge of the socket, leaving messy, hollow pits.
I have another researcher Henrik, who is actually listening along with me for the first time, and he pointed out the Serapeum was destroyed in the 3rd century, so how did a Crusader knight show up in it? That's 1,000-year difference in a history. Then Sergeant Walter Heller found a creature in a robe with a long, spindly figure and a lidless eye. Gertrude said...
What was it? A guardian of some sort, or perhaps it too was once an archivist.
Not to mention that March 1998, 6 months after the statement, there was an explosion at the location of said statement, killing 17 people. Is the implication that Gertrude instigated this? How did she get the connections to accomplish it? It has become abundantly clear to me that the act of archiving is dangerous. The gathering of libraries and stories and books in and of itself causes something to happen, makes people claw their own eyes out, or draws the attention of something to watch us. Episode 60, The Observer Effect, made abundantly clear that the Magnus Institute is one of these places. Rosa Myers felt the effects of being watched so ferociously that she attempted to drive a van of petrol into the Magnus Institute. I don't know why. And Jon doesn't know why. But Gertrude does. She figured it out. Which only means one thing. The answer's in the archives. Why did Jonah Magnus begin collecting ghost stories in the early 1800s? The only lead I have is a very, very small one. In episode 50, Foundations, statement maker Samson Kempthorne wrote a letter to Jonah in 1841 claiming that Magnus's
life consists of little but rattling around an Edinburgh townhouse surrounded by piles of ghostly accounts and lunatic documentation.
The only other time Edinburgh has been mentioned is in the very first episode, The Anglerfish. And now 2 victims are massive points of interest for other statements. Last episode we covered Sarah Baldwin. And in episode 54, Still Life, Daniel Rawlings, who went missing in Edinburgh in December of 2006, owned a taxidermy shop, of which has a connection to Brecon and Hope. Furthermore, it was implied that he was taxidermed himself. Of course, the impersonation of Sasha was sent to investigate, leading Jon to another dead end. Sarah Baldwin, stapling skin to herself. Maybe she's taxidermied too. Regardless of the logistics, I really think there's something connecting the anglerfish to Jonah Magnus. I haven't quite figured it out yet. And usually I'd whine that I haven't figured out a lot of things, but not today. Today I'm feeling pretty damn productive. I want to end on Gerard Key, and something that might be a lifeline. He ran into solo traveler Andrea Nunes in Genoa, Italy. He said she was marked, and gave her the advice to keep the face of her mother in mind. When she later had an encounter with a misshapen, analogous crowd, Nunes was able to get out of it through this warning. Maybe there's a way to get out. Or I'll have to keep a lighter handy. Oh my god, what is happening to me? Martin said something in the season 1 finale that stuck with me.
No, that's just whatever web these statements have caught you in, well, I'm there too. We all are, I think.
I don't know if I'm caught in a web or a spiral or if I am marked. I don't know the definitions of any of these traps, and I don't know which ones apply to Jonathan either. But I have figured out by now that the making of this video log qualifies as an archive. It has become a threat to my safety. I really should stop. But I can't. Can I? Some of you know why I can't, but telling me would ruin something. Something that I'm being turned into. And Jon's in trouble too. And Martin. And Tim. So, I'm going to help where I can. The more I figure out, the more I keep people safe. That is my lifeline. End statement. Supplemental. I typically don't discuss the paranormal aspects of myself, as it often tends to freak people out or result in invasive questioning. But clearly, you've noticed I'm an atypical archivist. No, I'm not a product of Jürgen Leitner's books. I have an identity of my own, thank you very much. But I'm losing my grip. Stories don't affect me like this. Yeah, I fall into the world, yes, but I don't lose myself. I don't resist things from invading into my head. I think the Magnus Archives is infecting me. I'm starting to worry that if I don't figure this out before Jon, the monsters that he's facing, they're going to try to get into my mind. And they're going to try to take me with them. And Supplemental.